we have reviewed the aggregate demand curve and thinking about what's going on in business cycles. Now what we want to do is take a little time to understand better the aggregate supply curve before we begin moving into an equilibrium or think about shifts in these curves. The aggregate supply curve is the quantity of goods and services that firms will produce at various price levels. And if you remember, we've got kind of two things here that we're looking at. We've got the quantity of goods and services, and we're talking about quantity here, right? And so we know that this really is what we're looking at is real GDP, real output within the economy. And then we've got at various price levels here, right? And so we've said kind of price levels, and we've talked about how we can measure that as the CPI or the GDP deflator. And just to kind of keep us on track, so I'm going to kind of mark this out here. And on the x-axis, we've said we'll sometimes see this as y, right? Or we've got real GDP. And then over here on the y-axis, what we're looking at is this price level here. And this is really nominal. So this is real, and nominal values are what we're looking at here. We're looking at what happens with changes in the price and the price level generically. So what we want to understand now is what is the aggregate supply curve? What does that look like? We know we've already kind of discussed the aggregate demand curve, and that's a downward sloping curve. I'll mark that as aggregate demand. We know that's a downward sloping curve for a number of reasons, right? The wealth effect, the interest rate effect, the exchange rate effect. We've kind of walked through those. Now what I want to think about is what's going on with the aggregate supply curve. And it turns out there's actually kind of two different models for the aggregate supply curve. And they both determine, or they're both dependent on the time horizon. So the time horizon here, what we're really talking about is, are we talking about the short run or are we talking about the long run? And we ask this because we've actually, if you remember back all the way back to when we've discussed kind of the production function and thinking about real GDP and what causes real GDP growth, we've kind of already discussed what's going on with long run aggregate supply or with long run trends in real GDP, right? We've kind of talked about what can actually influence that. And here, before we jump into the short run changes, which if you remember in the business cycle, this is kind of what we're trying to get at, I think it would help to review kind of the long run situation and think through what's going on here. So we know in the long run that GDP changes due to supply of labor. And let me just kind of mark this out here, right? So we know that GDP, real GDP change, right? This might change for a number of reasons, and it's really all the inputs that go into GDP, right? So this would be labor. If we have more labor, right? This would be capital. This would be resources, right? Natural resources. Things that can influence real GDP change. We've talked about human capital here. Human capital, which is really the this is kind of the skills and the education of the workforce itself. And then we've obviously talked about technology as well, and we've talked about technology as being the real important variable if you kind of think about the exogenous growth model when we're thinking about long run growth, that this technology leads to productivity. And so we've kind of, if you remember when we've talked about this, kind of the classic exogenous growth model was a simplified, we were looking at output, right? And this was a function of this technology variable, A, that we've discussed. And we were also interested in labor, and there's some sort of elasticity on labor, right, and capital, and there was some sort of elasticity on capital as well. In essence, what percentage of the economy is made up by these two inputs. And if you remember, we went through kind of a lot of transformation, but really what we were thinking about was, well, what if we think about this in terms of per unit or per individual, right? And when we did that, we kind of worked this out to have a production function here. And I'm going to draw this over here kind of simplistically, because if you remember on the x-axis, what we had was little k, and this little k was really capital, right? This was capital per worker. Per worker. I want to make sure I don't run out of space down there. Capital per worker. And then over here, right, what did we have? Well, we had little y. And that little y was really, if this is capital per worker, this was output per worker. Output per worker here. And what we were looking at was really, how can we increase that productivity? How can we make that output higher. And we talked about kind of having this relationship here where we had this production function. It's marked a number of different ways, right? But you might kind of classically see it as a function of the capital per worker. And so we saw this diminishing returns of capital per worker. And what is the capital? Well, these are the buildings that we have. This is the machinery that we have, the computers that we have for individuals to be able to do their work. And as we increase that capital per worker, as we increase those machines and the computers and that type of thing, it might make you slightly, right, it might make you more productive. You might be able to produce more work in your given day. However, there's going to be some diminishing returns to that. You only need so many computers at your desk, right, to run your reports. At some point, it's just an extra computer that's sitting there, and so you don't get as much return on the capital. When we've thought about these things, we were kind of thinking about what actually bends this curve, or what can shift this curve. And if you remember when we were talking about that, we really focused in on technology, that in the long run, right, we can have some changes here, but in the long run, it was really technology that would grow GDP, because what did that allow us to do? Well, it would make this capital much more effective. And so kind of in the most simplistic case, what did we see? Well, it would maybe shift, we would have some sort of technology shift that would move it to, and I'll put function, right, and I'll make it prime here. And what does that mean? Just at every given level of K, at this level of capital per worker, instead of having this level of output per worker, they would instead be at this level of output per worker. They would be much more productive. And that's really what we're looking at here. So what we're going to kind of see here is that this all transforms into a long run aggregate supply curve that we generally think of as vertical. Long run aggregate supply. And that's because this long run aggregate supply, it's really made up of these inputs, and we have some sort of input, right? And that's going to give us the real GDP. That's going to give us our real level of GDP. And unless we have some changes in these inputs within the economy, companies are not going to supply more goods. They won't have the ability to supply more goods unless they're more productive, unless there's technology improvements, or unless we're able to kind of systematically improve the level of skills for the workers that they have available to them. If we have some sort of big increase in the capital stock. So that's kind of what I want to just walk through here real quickly. If we think about it, and we've already summarized this up pretty well, just in kind of the general thinking of the long run trends here, that we know that there's not a number of things here that would change this too dramatically. So let's just think through these pieces here kind of one by one. So what do we know with labor? Well, with labor, when we're thinking about this, what might shift the long run aggregate supply curve, right? These are all the things that help firms supply products. So if we're thinking about this, labor, obviously if we have an increase in the population, if we have an increase in the, let's say, the labor force participation rate, right? And we can also think about this like if we were to have some sort of increase in immigration. Or you might also say if we have some sort of, right, decrease in unemployment. Any of these things here, right, any of these changes here, these would all shift. So you have to remember, right, we'd have some sort of steady state real GDP based off of our capital stock and our resources that we have within the economy, the labor that we have in our economy. And then if any of these were to change in a positive way, right, either unemployment falls or we have increases in those who are participating in the labor force, or immigration or population changes, those are things that would shift the long run aggregate supply curve to the right, right? And we would see this kind of shift in the long run aggregate supply curve. Let's think about some other things that might shift the long run supply curve, and I'm going to keep all of these as shifts to the right, things that would increase real GDP, and we can kind of think through what that's going to be here. Let's go ahead and do that with capital as well. So with capital, this is kind of what we were getting at here with the production function. So with capital, we know that an increase in capital, we can also think of that as right, if we just increase the capital stock, we buy more computers, something like that, right? That's also increasing the capital per worker, right? And if that's the case, when we increase the capital per worker, even though we have diminishing returns, if we move from this point to this point, we are still increasing, right? We're still increasing output per worker. And if everything else is held constant, that would mean that we are then increasing kind of big Y, right? We are increasing real GDP. And so this is something that would also shift, right? This is also something that would shift the long run aggregate supply curve to the right. You can think about a few other things here. So we've got like the third one here, I'll mark as resources, and we can kind of think through resources here. Resources. And what do we mean by resources? Well, kind of I think the most general way that we think about resources are the input goods that we use. I think the most common one that we can think of is like the natural resources like oil, right, or water or something like that. And if you're an economy, you have some sort of fixed amount of these things. However, if you had some sort of increase in it, right, if you had an increase in the availability, and that increase in availability could come from trade, right? It could come from exploration. It could come from technology, right? There's a number of reasons that our natural resources could in essence, that the stock of resources that are usable for supplying goods and services could increase. And if they did, right, all of those things are things that are key production inputs. They would stimulate technology improvements. And what do we know about technology improvements? That they increase, right? That they would increase at any given capital per worker, that they're going to increase our output per worker as well. And that is going to shift, right? Kind of that same logic here. That's going to shift the long run aggregate supply curve, right, to the right as well. So that would be another shift here to the right that we'd be seeing. I'll just go ahead and list out the last couple ones here. So we've got the fourth one that we can think of, which is human capital. And human capital, what we're really thinking about, as I said, is the education level, the skills that are available for individuals within the economy. If we increase the education, right, if we increase those skills, what do we think is going to happen? Why do we do that? Why do we invest so much of that in our, why do we spend so much government money on increasing educational abilities? Well, because we think that that increases productivity. Right, and increasing productivity does the exact same thing here, right? We see an increase in output per worker, per the individuals who have that increase in education, which is going to increase overall real GDP as well, right? That shift would increase real overall GDP as well, and that would be a shift in the long run aggregate supply curve, right, to the right. And we can kind of think through the last one here as well. What do we have with technology? With technology, what we're really thinking about is shifts in this production function. I'll just write technology here, right? We've already discussed this, right? This is kind of the technology that we've thought about that basically shifts the capital per worker, that we would have some sort of level of capital per worker, and that is going to make it much more productive, right? Your use of that copier machine, your use of that computer, maybe you come up with some sort of software that makes the computer itself even more productive for the work that you are doing in that business. And so increases in technology would also have, for all of these same reasons, an increase in real output, an increase in the long run aggregate supply curve to the right. And I'll just go and mark a sixth one here real quick as well, which is opening new markets. And we can think about this, right, as kind of being open to trade, so open to trade. And if you think about what's actually going on with opening to trade, well, there's a few different things that happen here, right? If we open to trade, that means we have more customers. If you're a supplier, that means that you have more potential individuals that you can sell goods to, so that would increase the long-run aggregate supply. There's more return on your investment. That means that there's increase in labor supply, right? Labor supply. You can think about Europe in basically making a very large free trade area among themselves. In fact, one of the biggest things that they have here is that labor can freely go from one country to the other within the European borders, and that's very beneficial for their economy as well, because if you're a supplier, that means that it allows you to also have kind of an increase, right, in capital movement. And it also allows you to have an increase in specialization, right? You can take technology advancements across borders, but you can also specialize. And we know that specialization within the economy would also have an increase, right? All of this would lead to an increase in real output and a long-run aggregate supply curve shift to the right. So we spend some time thinking about the long-run aggregate supply curve here. All of that is kind of a review of what we've talked about with the production function to set up why the short-run aggregate supply curve is so important in our analysis of business cycles.